I come back to you on the point that you've been making there, and from the evidence that we have got, regardless of whether your view on the principle of whether it should be state-run or the financial industry run, the main argument that has been put forward in evidence that we have received is that you could establish an operational fund far quicker if you piggyback on the existing industry rather than establish the mechanism. And look, I think everyone agrees if it is a state entity that's been established that's going to invest the fund, there is going to be a time lag involved in it. And it is important to point out it is a highly regulated industry under the jurisdiction of the Pensions Authority. None of that would change, and I think really all the accountabilities will be there, and the scrutiny is already there for the private pension and occupational pensions that are there, and we have the IORP system in place now for the Master Trust as well. So there'd be no dilution or diminution of that regulation and oversight already in place.
No, and that's
but
clear,
it would be a more streamlined approach
from the general scheme that this new fund has to comply with the existing law, both domestic and international law. So my question is, based on your view of what has happened elsewhere, what is the time differential? What's genuinely the timeline to establish this piggybacking on the existing industry? A genuine estimate in relation to it. Like, we have people saying that this can be done in 12 months. I don't realistically believe on the 1st of January 2024, regardless of what approach is taken, that this can be effectively up and running. But a genuine estimate as an industry, how do you see those timelines being delivered, the time involved in this? Second question, it's throwing back a question to you, Ms. Thornton, regarding your question regarding the change in approach following the publication of the Strawman report. And could I ask, would that have anything to do with some of the reports that we've had from Charlie Weston, the legislation that has been accepted at second stage by from Deputy Jed Nash in relation to the lack of transparency on fees? And if I quote from one headline in the Irish Independent, 6 in every €10 in pension pot being consumed by charges. The lack of transparency in relation to charges, the concern that there is there that if you have an agent of the state gathering money which is only going to fund the fees of the pension industry, may that have been the reason for the change in approach, leaving aside the fact that in this the general scheme there is a cap on fees. But do you think that that may have been a factor for the change in approach? Thank you.
I'll take your last question first, if I may, Deputy. I would hope that the headline was not behind a change in public policy, and I would hope that the legislators were able and the department is able to look beyond that and look at the evidence that is actually presented when they actually review the information in the private sector, in the private pension market. 6 in 10 of every euro going in pension charges, I do not recognise, our members do not recognise, and we were clear about that at the time. It is not a fee we recognise. I have seen some of those headlines, I have seen some of the reports, and we have looked at the evidence in it. We have looked at the evidence from our own members, and it looks like some of those figures are based on, if I can phrase this correctly, they're based on assuming the maximum available fees for everything involved in a pension, be that the advice on a pension, be that the asset under management charge, be that policy fees, be that contribution charge or investment charges. It kind of seems to assume that the maximum charges possible permitted under the regulation is taken. Okay. Now, we have a very competitive private pension market in Ireland, and I don't think I've ever seen, and if I have, it's very rare, maximum fees being taken on a pension. The fees that are taken on a pension are commensurate with the services that are provided for that pension, and that will differ widely across what the individual or what the employer wants. So, for a standard occupational scheme with a default choice, with the employer doing most of the information and meeting most of their obligations, you can expect the charges to be quite low. And in some instances, the reduction in yield, which is what's used to measure the impact of pension charges on a product, can be lower than what the proposed cap on auto-enrolment are. particularly for very large schemes. However, the more services that are provided, it's like everything, the more services that are provided by the pension provider, the more cost is involved with that, the more there is an impact on the reduction in yield of their pension. And that gets to be agreed between, for an occupational scheme, it's agreed between the employer and the pension provider. For obviously a personal scheme, it's agreed between the individual and your pension provider what they are going to do for the services. Now, to your point on transparency, I don't think you will meet anyone who works in pensions who would disagree that more transparency is needed in that area. I think it's widely acknowledged. It's very, very complicated. The way the reduction in yield is actually relayed to an individual, it's relayed to an individual in something called their Statement of Reasonable Projection, or their SORP. They're very complicated actuarial calculations. They're very difficult for those of us who work in the pensions environment to understand. I'm not an actuary. I read my pension summary and go, okay, I'll come back to it later. So definitely we would agree there are some measures needed to make pensions more understandable. That's the information needs to be clearer. There's a lot of disclosure that goes to you when you take out a pension, and I'm sure all of you know. There's a lot of information, and a lot of it is quite legalistic because it has to be. So there are a lot of work to be done on the disclosure and making the information about pensions clearer to individuals. There is also a lot of work that has to be done on financial education for all to understand what a pension is, how it works, and the fact that you're actually paying yourself. So to the point that the auto-enrolment, you know, there are individuals who are going to be seeing this as an extra tax, or I'm losing income. You're actually not. You're paying your future self at the end of the day, and you're making sure that when you get to the end of your working life, you have a standard of living in retirement that is not dropped when you stop working. In terms of the timelines, your first question, it's an interesting question. I do have, we all know that the setup does involve significant cost, and even if the general scheme changes and we do go to piggyback on the existing pension infrastructure, there will be changes that need to be done, but ultimately that will depend on what the final legislation says. Now, I do know that some of our members, when the SSIA savings plan was in place, some of our members did provide access to an investment-based SSIA plan. So some of our members may well have the functionality in their system already, others may have to build it, for example. But ultimately, the timeline will depend on what the final requirements are. So it would be disingenuous for me to sit here and say, oh, it'll be done in 2 years, or it'll be done in 12 months. We don't know until you see the final rules what the build is going to take.
But I think it is important to draw on the experience of our neighbours with Nest when they established the UK auto-enrolment scheme. And that took, I think, approximately 5 years to establish. And you know, that is understandable when you have to build a competent team and go out through the public appointment system, recruit, train, establish the organisational structures. You know, I think it's a very, very ambitious timeline, and we're all chasing a finite number of experienced pension professionals, and we have to have the competency in the organisation to deliver on the mandate and deliver as set out in the bill all of the functions and executive functions and responsibilities of the CPA. So that is not a small undertaking at all, and you know, it will require time and you know, resources to do that.
Thank you. Deputy